In this lecture, we're going to be discussing a very ancient school of Indian thought, in fact, more ancient than Brahmanism in some respects. This school is called the Sankhya school, and the word basically means analysis or discrimination. Now, this is no longer a school that it has active adherents, or at least if there are some, not many. But it's important in that it had a lot of influence on later Indian thought. And also, I think it's very useful to show us certain tendencies in Indian thought. One in particular, the tendency to analyze in great detail whatever is under discussion. In the West, Aristotle perhaps comes to mind as the philosopher who is particularly given to this sort of approach, certainly in the ancient world. Sankhya is attributed to a philosopher named Kapila in the 7th century BCE, although there's not much known about him. He's probably a legendary figure. It's thought perhaps that he was opposing the Upanishads. Perhaps some of the Upanishads were written at the same time, and he might have been offering a different worldview. Unfortunately, the way that Sankhya comes to us is not from any text that dates back nearly that far. In the Indian tradition I mentioned, there is a long textual tradition. But one problem with the textual tradition is that not all of the texts that have been known to exist actually still exist. Sometimes new discoveries are made. Some texts that were actually not preserved in Sanskrit, but translations of them in the Pali language have been discovered recently. So sometimes these views that we've lost a lot have to be revised, and so much the better. But nevertheless, the Sankhya system has roots long before we have records of it. The Indologist Heinrich Zimmer actually thinks that the Sankhya school draws on elements of thought that was practiced in or believed in the Indian subcontinent before the arrival of the Aryans, the Indo-European tribes who gradually invaded the Indian subcontinent between 1500 and 1000 BCE. And there are certain elements of it that resemble some of the features of Brahmanism, but certain others that are in direct opposition to them, and we'll be talking about those. As far as systematic expositions of Sankhya, supposedly there were early texts as early as the 4th century BCE, but none of these really early texts survive. And the text that's taken to be authoritative about the system is one coming from the 5th century CE, written by Ishvara Krishna. The basic idea of Sankhya, in a sense, can be summed up quickly. It's a dualistic system that claims there are two kinds of things. Basically, the two kinds of beings are consciousness, called Purusha, and nature or matter, Prakriti. And everything we experience has to do with the conjunction of these two. Now, in a way, this might sound a little bit like the mind and the body in the West. We, too, have a notion of a mind that is conscious and material things, our bodies being one of them, that somehow consciousness is connected up with. And the system has some of the same challenges that, for instance, Cartesian dualism faces. If you're going to say there are two kinds of things, how do they get together? But it's a little bit of a mistake to think of this as too much like the Western issue of mind and body, partly because there's a very different sense of counting that goes on the two sides of the divide between Prakriti and Purusha. Prakriti, or nature, the material world, is considered all to be one thing. There's only one Prakriti. On the other hand, there are many conscious beings, lots of Purushas, and each one of us, for instance, has our own Purusha. One thing that's rather distinctive about Samkhya by comparison with Brahmanism is that both of these are considered to be real. As we were mentioning in the last lecture, in Brahmanism, only one thing is fundamentally real, namely Brahman. But for the Sankhya system, both Prakriti and Purusha are real, and Purusha admits of lots of distinct particular Purushas. What we need to do, according to this system, is figure out the true connection, or the true nature of ourselves. And interestingly enough, the aim here is to eliminate our connection to Prakriti. So as a conscious mind, what I'm aiming to do if I am an adherent of this system is trying to detach myself from the world of nature. Purusha is not to be thought of as self-consciousness. I think if we think about Descartes' notion of the mind, that would be a pretty obvious way of looking at it. My mind is a thinking substance, Descartes says, and what am I aware of first of all? Well, of myself. We don't get this picture with Purusha. Strictly speaking, Purusha has no relationship to anything. And that's, in fact, what we need to recover from our experiences. If we do manage to detach our conscious mind from everything else, everything in the natural world that is, then we discover a kind of freedom. Now, I think for us this is an odd notion of freedom, particularly because the way we've talked about freedom thus far, it's had to do with ability to act in certain ways. And Purusha isn't acting in a world anymore if we manage to free Purusha from Prakriti. So it isn't a matter of free activity. I think freedom here means something like uncoerced. The issue for the Sankhya system is that much of the time we feel all these pressures from what seems to be reality for us, the Prakriti world. Nature impinges on us and we feel sort of pressure to do one thing or another. We don't recognize this free nature that we have that's uncoerced. But if we get back to the point where we recognize consciousness as something that really doesn't have any relationship to Prakriti, then we have that kind of freedom. So from a Western point of view, we might call this a negative freedom. It's a freedom from certain kinds of pressures. But in terms of doing anything, Purusha is, in a sense, not very active. It has no world to act on in its own, if we take it to the point where we really understand it as something separate. It doesn't have any agenda. It's sometimes called the supreme witness, but strictly speaking, Purusha isn't even observing things in the world once this separation has been made. So how do the two work together before we get to this point where we realize ourselves to be supreme consciousness? Well, everything that exists in Prakriti is visible to us only because Prakriti and Purusha are joined. In other words, when we think about things in the world, features of it, our consciousness is somehow conjoining itself with aspects of the material world. A way to think of this is to think about the way light looks when it goes through a crystal or a prism. All the colors that we see when light does this were already in the light in the first place, but we don't really see them until they go through the crystal. Well, similarly, the conjunction of Purusha and Prakriti needs to happen before we notice any of the things that we observe in this world. What we call our personality is just this conjunction of Purusha and Prakriti. And as long as this conjunction occurs, there's a kind of self that we have that involves both, and this self transmigrates. This is a point where reincarnation enters the picture. Insofar as we're bound to Prakriti, we do have a self that moves forward in time beyond death. But this is a cycle that the Sankhya system thinks we should try to avoid or get out of. Transmigration is not viewed as a positive thing in Indian thought generally. The idea is to overcome this kind of continuing flow forward of some kind of self in a deficient way of understanding it. The self that's, in this case, contaminated with Prakriti. I should mention here that a very typical tendency in a lot of Indian thought is to speak in terms of something like pollution or contamination of the true self or our true understanding. And that's very much the case in the Sankhya system. The notion is that our true self is something that is pure. And because this self, the Purusha, has become somehow implicated in the material world, all we get is a kind of fallen version of that self. We don't really recognize this true self, and we end up being pressured by things that are really something like contaminants. So if we can manage to free Purusha from this plight, which really does have to do with the way our minds understand things, then we return to the freedom that's really our primordial nature. Now, Purusha admits of, as I said, many, many kinds of things. So you can say, well, we've got Prakriti on one hand, Purusha on the other, but there are actually lots of Purushas. Prakriti is one thing, but Prakriti is actually what ends up being analyzed in great detail. Why? Because nature manifests itself in multiple ways. It's a kind of picture that we might call emanationist. In other words, there's basically Prakriti, but it manifests itself on one level, and this in turn gives way to further manifestations and so on. I'll be talking about how the human mind manifests itself, the human personality, I should say. The human personality is manifest beginning with a most fundamental level of Prakriti starting to manifest itself in the world. But actually the human being ends up having 23 different principles on this system. So as I said before, it's a very analytic kind of system. You might wonder why bother with an analysis of personality in this way. To a large extent, the Sankhya system views this as a diagnostic tool. We might ask similarly why Freud decided to talk about the ego, id, and superego. Well, he eventually had a lot of theoretical commitment to these ideas, but the initial motivation for them was to try to make some kind of diagnosis of what's going on in people with some real mental disorders. And how does he do that? Well, talking about subcomponents of the personality. Sankhya tries to do the same thing, but it does this in a lot of distinct detail. The basic manifestation of Prakriti is something called the three gunas. Guna meaning aspect. Sometimes this is translated as strand, and I think one way of looking at it is something like the various parts of strands that go into making a rope. If we think of three strands sort of braided together to make a rope, that would be in a way a model of what Prakriti is doing. It manifests itself in these three different aspects. And these are the most general and abstract, and they apply to the most different kinds of things. The three gunas, as they are called, end up being manifest in things like psychological nature, but also in the external world. Various theories of diet in Indian thought make use of the three gunas. Some food, for example, makes you clear, intelligent, highly conscious. And this would correspond to the first of the gunas, sattva. Sattva guna is the guna that one at least tries to have a preponderance of. I think just in psychological life it makes sense that someone might want to be clear and intelligent. The other two gunas, which in dietary discussion are effects of other kinds of food, are rajas and tamas. Rajas is the guna of activity and passion. If you eat something that makes you feel very animated, perhaps a little bit shakily so, that would be an instance of a rajas food or a rajasic food. The rajas guna is what has to do with the various ways in which we see activity, dynamic behavior, and so on in psychological life. Tamas, the third guna, is dark, inert. Whatever weighs you down is a manifestation of tamas. And the true self is most evident when sattva predominates. Although all of us are combinations of all three, whenever we can manage to get sattva to predominate, there's more stillness in our being, in our personality, and that allows the true nature, the Purusha, to shine through. We'll see that this particular aspect of the Sankhya system gets picked up by later schools of Indian thought, even schools that don't agree with many features of the system. We'll be talking about the Bhagavad Gita, an important text within a major epic in the Indian tradition, and it makes use of the gunas, even though it doesn't have such a negative view of the material, natural world as the Sattva system does. And this, I think, is a really kind of basic contribution that the Sankhya system has made. The Sankhya system's particular analysis of human psychology is complex, and many new, to many minds' way of looking at it, improved visions of the human personality have been proposed since. But nevertheless, just to give you a sense of a sort of flavor of the way Samkhya works, I'll go ahead and indicate some of the levels of the human personality. All of us, as I mentioned, are manifestations of the three gunas. But from the gunas, there's another level of manifestation, and that's called the buddhi. This is an impersonal intelligence. Now, that's kind of a strange thought, I think, because we're accustomed in the West to thinking about the person and intelligence being pretty much the same thing. If you think about Descartes' notion of the thinking self being who one fundamentally is, this is very much a personal self. But the idea here is that intelligence isn't really so much a function of our individuality as we usually think. This is something that is not attached to our particular ego, but is a kind of spontaneous manifestation of thought and awareness. Our conscious minds can't control it. I think maybe a way of getting some impression of what it is that's being suggested here is to think of those occasions when suddenly a thought comes into your mind. You didn't call it. You weren't expecting it at all. In fact, it might even be an idea you're not particularly happy about. But nevertheless, it's just appeared. This would be very much in keeping with the Sankhya idea that much of what we call the mind in the West is really not what the Sankhya system would call the mind at all. It's certainly not something that's individual, but it's a kind of awareness that is actually what's spontaneously moving in us. So sometimes we do think that we're controlling the direction of thought, but this is just an illusion. It's actually something that is much more impersonal that's just acting through us. So after the gunas, we have the buddhi. Beyond that, there's another level that's produced. It manifests or kind of emanates from the buddhi, and this is the ego, AHAMKARA. The ego is, in a way, much the way we use the term in the West, or even the way that Freud uses it to a certain extent. Namely, it has to do with what's individually ours. Typically, what the AHAMKARA does is take the sorts of things that the buddhi does, its general awareness, and claim, this is mine. So suppose I have a thought that just kind of came into mind and I didn't seem to have much control over it at all. I'm very happy to take that thought and get credit for it. I might write a paper or a book, or I might start announcing this everywhere and get quite famous, perhaps, if this is an interesting enough thought. None of that is really appropriate from the Sankhya point of view, because it wasn't the individual ego that caused the thought in the first place. But that's what the ego does. It sort of claims everything that is produced by the buddhi and claims that actually it belongs to this individual. The ego produces a number of further aspects of the self. One of these, manas, is basically the root of our word mind. And here, mind is meant, in a sense like Descartes uses it, to be a thinking faculty. And it is understood as affected by the ego. But as I mentioned, ultimately, the psyche in a larger sense includes this impersonal element as well. And the mind here is really just thinking. If I think about my ego, although I might be thinking about having an egotistical relationship to my own thoughts, in other words, I want to say, these are mine and I ought to get credit. Nevertheless, there's a sense in which the thinking is only one part of the ego. I have a lot of attitudes as well that aren't, strictly speaking, thoughts. Those too would be claimed by my ego to be mine. And all of this would be a manifestation, ultimately, of something more impersonal. So we have the mind being produced by the ego. Also certain functions, abilities that we have that we notice in dealing with the world. Our sense functions and our motor functions, for example, are all produced in the same way. They also are products that emerge from the ego. Probably the most interesting of these sets of elements that emerge from the ego are the subtle elements. Now, the subtle elements, if you look at a diagram of all these elements, it sort of looks like you've got duplicity, because you've got something that looks like the five senses, and then you've got the five senses as functions, and then you've got things in the world that correspond to the five senses. The subtle elements are basically the inward mental capacities to respond to the things that our senses take in. Now, this is hardly the same theory that Kant has, but I think comparing this view to Kant's idea can be somewhat helpful in the following way. Kant's view is that the way we take in our picture of the world depends on the kind of faculties that we have. Well, here there's a notion that we already have to have potentials, capacities to respond to certain kinds of things before the activity of the senses taking them in is going to have anything to do with our personality in the first place. I mean, imagine there were a sixth sense, but none of us have it. Well, there may indeed be, for a creature that did have it, some other dimension of the world that's experienced, but it's not something that we know anything about. We already have to have, in a sense, the wiring or the setup in order to hook the world up in these certain ways. So there are these subtle elements as well. And one thing I should say also about the manas, the mind, is that it interacts with the various functions that we have. All these have been manifestations coming out of the ego, but you can subdivide them to make certain kinds of points about what's going on inside the person. Now, all of what I've talked about so far in the human being is put together in the Sankhya system as the subtle body. The subtle body is a notion having to do with what about the person continues beyond death. And what would be said here is that the subtle body is what goes on. It's all mental. I mean, one of the rather odd things about the subtle faculties that I was just talking about, the subtle elements, is they're all, in a sense, the wiring or the setup within our psychology. We aren't yet talking about the external world at this point. And this whole setup does move from life to life in transmigration experience. The way all these things interact is, of course, sometimes cause for problems, but they all do interact together and become a whole system. Zimmer, who I quoted a few minutes ago, talking about his speculations about how early the Sankhya system traces to, has a kind of colorful image for the way this system works together. He claims that the intellect, which is his translation for manas, is like the local governor who collects the experiences of the outer senses and presents them to the finance minister, which is what he compares to the AHAMKARA, the ego, whence they go to the chancellor, the BUDDHI, or the faculty of judgment. So all of this does work together, and we tend to miscredit these various experiences we have as being our own in a narrow personal sense. This is one element of the Sankhya system that resembles certain features of the Brahmanic system. Much of what we take to be our own private sphere really isn't on this system. There's a parallel, even though some of the other features are somewhat different. After we have this whole subtle body, and we understand this to be basically what survives death, also something that we can have a sense of when we have certain experiences in yoga, about which I'll say more soon, or for that matter in dreams. But this is what survives. Nevertheless, as long as we're alive, it's also interacting with the physical world. And so the final level of this very complicated picture is the sense functions, the motor functions, and the subtle elements all plug into various features of the physical world, which are named in terms of elements that are fairly familiar to us, fire, air, etc. And again, it's only because we already have the wherewithal in terms of the way the personality is structured up to that point that we can interact with gross physical features of the world. And in our whole sensory experience, it's this subtle body, all of these faculties that I've been discussing, hooking up with the gross elements of the world. And we view that as an experience of external reality. Now, that's how it works. Unfortunately, what we want to happen is not to be paying attention to external reality, because ultimately the problem from the Sankhya point of view is that we take all of this material world as seriously related to Purusha, our true self. And the trick is to somehow make the true self independent of all that. It's very complicated. Many things about that system can cause us to pay attention to one thing or another, and that is the bulk of our experience. but true spiritual liberation comes from something else. The system often proposed as a means of doing this is called yoga. And this is a term that is used in lots of different schools. Yoga is essentially a system of practices that are used to purify the mind and enable one to be disciplined enough to gain the spiritual goal. But yoga is in particular linked to Sankhya because of a text called the Yoga Sutras that assume a lot of the Sankhya view. The text is allegedly written by a thinker called Patanjali. And Patanjali is mostly legendary in that we don't know a lot about Patanjali. And probably much of the Yoga Sutra, as it comes down to us, isn't written by someone who lived at the time that Patanjali lived. But nevertheless, the Sankhya system is sort of the background that this yoga account is referring to. The Yoga Sutras were allegedly written in the 2nd century BCE. They differ from the Sankhya system in 2 respects, even though to a large extent Sankhya is presupposed. One is that God is mentioned. We don't get any discussion of God in the Sankhya system as such. Secondly, the Yoga Sutras are very practical. The Sankhya interpreters of the Yoga Sutras would say they show us the way to get to this insight of our true nature, the Purusha, and they show us the way to detach from viewing the Purusha as seriously related to Prakriti, our mistake being to think that the two actually are conjoined. Yoga is a means of liberation, whoever is reading it. And as Zimmer puts it, it shows us that the outer world is a projection of our own minds. If we start to believe that the outer world is a projection of our own minds, then that enables us to have some sense of how to deal with it, or how to deal with this projection. We can vary the projection. The opening of the Yoga Sutras points out that this is really what yoga is all about, coming to control the way the mind projects the world. The opening line is simply, yoga is the control of the thought waves in the mind. So what we're trying to do is to still the mind. In fact, the mind is already something like a mirror, which might seem that it's more still than we realize. But the way it mirrors is usually to mirror the activity or the commotion all around us. The Yoga Sutras go on, just as the pure crystal takes color from the object which is nearest to it, so the mind, when it is cleared of thought waves, achieves sameness or identity with the object of its concentration. So what we need to do is concentrate on what is still and not to allow everything that passes us by to become a means of captivating the mind. The Purusha in reality is absolutely isolated and nothing affects it, is the Samkhya view. And the Yoga Sutras goes along with this, that actually if we really come to understand things, the things in the external world really don't touch what's really fundamental. So what yoga attempts to do is remove the various kinds of activities of the mind, to make the mind still, and to help us to overcome what are called klesas, or hindrances. These hindrances are the things that prevent us from recognizing our true nature. And there are 5 types that are listed. Avidya, a word we'll encounter again, which means ignorance. This is just basically naive consciousness, the way the world looks to us when we start out. When we come to recognize that all that Prakriti presents to us really doesn't touch our true nature, then we know the truth. But we have to come to recognize that. Ego is another hindrance to recognizing the truth. Any kind of attachment to things in the world are hindrances. But at the same time, so is hatred or repugnance against something. And finally, even the will to live is a hindrance in this respect. The will to live is a kind of desire to keep things going as they now appear. And that binds us ever more deeply in the illusion that Prakriti is something that really matters to us. So if the goal is to isolate the Purusha from Prakriti, what we're aiming at fundamentally is this pure status of the witness. Now, one is actually a witness only so long as one continues to live. If one continues to live having come to recognize that Purusha is the true self, then we will indeed see things around us. But at the same time, as we see things operating around us in nature, they don't affect us. We don't feel any need to respond to them. And gradually this causes the gross and subtle bodies to wind down. Finally, someone who recognizes this no longer experiences reincarnation. I'll conclude with the conclusion of the Yoga Sutras. The whole universe, with all its objects of sense knowledge, becomes as nothing in comparison to that infinite knowledge which is free from all obstructions and impurities. Then the sequence of mutations of the gunas has come to an end, for they have fulfilled their purpose. Since the gunas no longer have any purpose to serve for the Atman, they resolve themselves into Prakriti. This is liberation. The Atman shines forth in its own pristine nature as pure consciousness. Thank you.